Okay, I want to start this morning a new series, and it's for a specific reason. I want you to consider some things that I've been just looking at more recently here, and it is what is taking over our world, what is happening in our world, and um, what I want to do is to encourage you to be a light, to encourage you to be the light, because there's only one light, and it's Jesus Christ. And Jesus is living in us, and if he's living in us, then we become the light. He says we are a city that is set on a hill that cannot be hid. So I'm wanting to encourage us to be that beacon of light, that beacon of hope for a world that is living in fear and in despair. Um, as I I've had some challenges just trying to put things together because of the amount of things I had doing this week. But I want us to go back to the very beginning, and I'm going to, if I should give a title, it's going to be a long title, but I want you to remember it. I'll try to remind you of it each week as we continue to explore this topic. The title of this series is going to be Sin, Its Effects, Consequences, reversals, and removal. It's a long topic, but as we repeat it over and over, you'll remember sin, its effects, consequences, reversals, and removal. And so this week, I'm just going to start with part one as we go to God's creation, the creation. We're going to look at the creation and see some of the interesting facts that we can draw from God and His creation. I hope to bring to you what God's intent was when He created this world. So we're going to start with at the beginning, and we're going to go right back to Genesis. Now, as we look at God's creation in part one, I want you to consider what it says here. In the beginning, God. I have been having some conversation with someone as it relates to this idea of God, and I didn't realize. I mean, for me, I can understand this clearly. For others, they can't. It's not easy to grasp. But the word says, "In the beginning, God." Um, Now, was that the beginning of everything in the beginning, or was it talking about a beginning? Was this beginning of Genesis 1:1 the beginning of the entire world, or was this just the beginning of God? And it's an interesting question, and I've had this question asked, and I want to just explore it a little bit. In the beginning, God. Now, God was from the beginning, or was God before the beginning? God was, there is no beginning with God, right? I remember when I was younger, I asked a question. I said, where did God come from? Right? As a child, I remember asking the question, and I don't remember who it was that somebody said, quoted a verse, I think it was from Isaiah or Jeremiah, that says, God is from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. I mean, there's a verse in the Word that actually says that. But God is without beginning, and so I just want to ask a question or two here at the very outset of what we're going to look at. Now, if God has no beginning, then all beginnings would be after God. God is without beginning. God has no beginning. God has always existed. As long as you can think of, God has always existed. Now, let me ask you a question, because this seemed to be an interesting perspective that thinkers think about. It is this: what was the form of God before the beginning? See, if God has no beginning, and he talks about a beginning, then it has to be the beginning of the earth or the beginning of the creation of the earth. But before that, if we say God existed before anything else existed, what was the form of God? What was his form? Before Jesus was born, since the word of God tells us that Jesus is the beginning of the creation of God, what was the form of God? In other words, Jesus was the first that came that was of God that came after God. Jesus came after God. He was born, and before he was born, God existed. But what was his form? That is the question that have been asked. Now, would God need a form if there was nothing else but him? If there was no one else but God, would God need a form? Now, the Word of God tells us clearly that God is a spirit. So here's the challenge that sometimes folks do have. If God is a spirit, and the Bible says He's a spirit, how is it that the Bible says God sits on a throne? How is it that the Bible describes God as having a form, having hair and face and hands and all of this? So I want to just talk about this for a short moment as we consider that if God never had creation, he would not need a form. He would be a spirit, and he never needed a form until he had created beings that he needed to interact with. So once he had created beings that he needed to interact with, then he had to assume a form. I don't like to use the word assume. He took on a form, and the form is the form that we read about in Revelation. We read about in the book of Daniel, that he had a form, and we know that the form that he has is a form like unto us. Why? Because we were made in his image. I think we'll probably cover that later on. So the beginning tells us here that God was spirit, but once Jesus came into existence and other created beings came into existence, then he needed a form for them to interact with. Nevertheless, I want you to consider this, that the truth is that God, the real essence of God, the reality of God is not so much the form, but the spirit. That is also true about us, that we are spirits living in a body. All right, I know for many people that is almost like a turnout. They say, "What? What are you talking about?" But this is the truth about our existence. That the real me is inside of this body. The real me, the body is really the house. And this is not necessarily where I wanted to go, but I'll just say this for now, and maybe we can look at that later. But First Corinthians 5 talks about this. First Peter chapter 1 talks about that. Peter talking about his tabernacle that he would have to put off, that God showed him that he would have, he will die eventually and would put off this body. But this is the reality, that God is a spirit. Now, God can be everywhere all at once by spirit. And I think that is also one of the major reasons why Jesus had to go, because if he did not go, he could not be everywhere at the same time. He had to go back to heaven, be glorified by the Father, and then his spirit could come, and his spirit could be here with me in Jamaica, sitting in my home. It could be 5 blocks away in Brother David's home, sitting in his home, and it also could be in Australia, it could be in Romania and in Germany, and all over the place, all at once. As we are speaking, God is with us. So by his spirit, he fills us all. But that spirit is the void of the body. The body is on the throne, and it's still God that is on the throne, but he can emanate and be everywhere all at once. And that is why the spirit, and I hope I'm not saying too much, and that's why the spirit says of the spirit that the spirit proceedeth from God. So the spirit is always proceeding from God. Of the Son, it says that he proceeded and came forth, a finished process, while the spirit proceedeth is always coming from God. I'm hoping that makes sense as we go on. So it says of Jesus that he was in fact, in Revelation chapter 3, it says that Jesus is the beginning of the creation of God, right? And it was the first of God's creative act, if I would put it that way. I think another translation does say it that way. So Jesus then, once Jesus came into existence, what the word teaches clearly is this, that Jesus became the medium or the channel through which God, who is the source, created. Now, let's see if I can find a verse that actually says that, because one, I probably could look at 2 verses or so quickly. One is in Colossians, and the other is in Corinthians. Colossians. In the book of Colossians chapter 1, we look at a couple of things that are said here in Colossians chapter 1. And I want you to consider what he says here when he talks about, Paul talks about how that God has delivered us from the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. So now the Son is the subject, and he says, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sin. Look at what he says next about the Son, who is, look at what he says. Paul says this of the Son of God, Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. Look at what he says next. And that's what Revelation says, that he was the beginning of the creation of God, or the first of God's creative acts. Look at verse 16. It says, for by him, Jesus, were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether there be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. Look at what the next verse says, verse 17. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. So that's an interesting perspective that I want you to keep in mind. For he was before all things, and by him all things consist. In fact, let me just quickly go up to chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians here, and look at what Paul says here. Paul says, but to us, speaking of Christians, but to us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. So Paul here is making it clear that God the Father was the one of whom, in other words, God the Father was the source of all things, and Jesus the Son was the medium or the channel through which the source worked. I hope that that is making perfect sense here. It could be just revision for most of us, but it's a necessary revision as we look at this plan of God in the creation of man. Now, the creation of the earth was really a plan that God and His Son orchestrated, and that this plan was to make man. This plan was to make a planet, Earth, and this plan was to, or let me not say make a planet. Something about the creation that says that when God came to create, the earth had already existed, that water was on the face of the earth. Anyway, think about what he says here, that what the plan was, that God was going to create a world and put a being on the earth, a being called man, and that this man would be the sovereign. He would be the king, or he'd be the sovereign of the earth. In fact, it does say that all things were to be placed under his control, and he was supposed to have dominion. In fact, what it says in Genesis chapter 1 is that God says, let us make man in our own image. And you know, interestingly, somebody sent me something that I really found to be interesting this morning. Somebody sent me, and you probably have heard this before, but it was just something that touched me as I was looking at because I was already looking at this to present today. But here's what it says. It says, when God wanted to create fish, he spoke to the sea. When God wanted to create trees, he spoke to the earth. When God wanted to create man, he turned it to himself and said, let us make man in our own image. And that's an interesting perspective. When God wanted to create man, he turned to himself. But look at what they said eventually. If you take fish out of water, it will die. And when you remove a tree from the soil or from the earth, it also dies. Likewise, when man is disconnected from God, he dies. God is our natural environment. We are created to live in his presence. We have to be connected to him because it is only in him that life exists. Let's stay connected to God. We recall that water without fish is still water, but fish without water is nothing. The soil without a tree is still the soil, it's still the earth, but the tree without the soil is nothing. Likewise, God without man is still God, but man without God is nothing. I remember that, and I just wanted to share that with you because it was a little boost to me in just looking at in trying to share the things I wanted to share, that this is really the truth, that if we're not connected to him,
Powerful.
indeed, if we're not connected to him, then we are nothing. So so this was God's plan. God's plan was that he said man was to have dominion over the earth, and that man, he gave man, he told them that they were to multiply and replenish the earth, and that they were to subdue the earth. I was just looking at those verses, those two words. I took careful note of what it said, that man was to have dominion. It also said that man was supposed to subdue the earth. Now I want you to consider the word dominion actually means to reign as a king. I think the original root word of word dominion is to dominate, really, to have control over. Now, and the word subdue actually means to conquer, or to keep on, to subjugate, or to keep under, or under subjection, right? And so this is the idea that God had when he said man was supposed to take over the earth. Man was to be to dominate and subdue the earth. This was the idea that God had, and that man was king on this planet. So this was God's plan. I'm simply bringing this forward because I wanted to establish this at the beginning, that this was God's plan for the new creation man, that he was to be king, and he was to rule, and he was to govern, and all things, all created things, were under his subjection. Now, what is interesting is that God did not create man to subjugate man, or to dominate, or rule man. God created man to rule the creation. I want that to be made clear at the beginning. Now, was there anything that was created? There's a question. Was there anything that you can think of that was created that was not under the power and authority of man? Because man was given control of all that were created, right? But as you think about that question,
Forbidden tree.
okay, okay, yeah, that's a good one that we'll cover next. But I want you to think about the outside of the tree. I want you to think about what was in the creation of God that man did not have control over. So everything
It
man
was his breath.
all right, but
Who said
that came from God as well. Now,
That man is not in control of, only God.
correct, right? So I'm just saying what God created in terms of the creation, not in terms of himself, because man did not have control. Man did not have control or the right to dominate himself. Man had the right to dominate and be king to the creation,
but
okay?
not to other man.
Right, not to other man. So here's the thing that, and the reason why I'm saying this is nothing. I mean, it says that even the bird, it said man had control over the cattle, man had control over the fowls of the air, man had, and how would that be? Because the birds were not in a cage, the cattle were not in a pen. So how was man able to control these things? Man had control over even the fishes in the sea, but they were not in an aquarium, right? They were not in a pond. So I'm asking you to consider then, how was man able to dominate? How was man able to control, to subdue, and to have dominion over all of these? It was simply this, by his words. See, man was made in the very image of God. The way that God created was simply by speaking, as the book of Psalms tells us, that in fact, as I said, Psalm, I'm thinking about even Psalms chapter 8, where it says in Psalms 8, I'm thinking about Psalms 8, I know, I'm thinking of a verse, but let me just run there quickly. But Psalms chapter 8 puts it this way. Psalm chapter 8. Let's pick up in verse 3. When I consider the heavens and the works of thy hand, David says, and the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. Here's the question he asks: what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou hast visited him? For, look at what David says next. For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hand. Okay, that's what I should have said. The works of his hand. Thou hast put all things under his feet. Thou hast put all things under man's feet. Look at what it says. These all things includes all the sheep, the oxen, yea, the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, and whatsoever that passeth through the parts of the sea. man had dominion and control over all of these things. That's what the psalmist says. Now, but my question is, and I want to bring that forth again, how was man to dominate? How was man to rule in this way? It was simply by his words. So if he needed to speak to a bird, he would speak to a bird and the bird would obey him. He could speak to a lion and the lion would obey. He would speak to a fish in the sea and the fish in the sea would obey as well. So man had that complete control, but also man had control over microscopic elements like viruses and bacteria and funguses, even though those were not in the creation of God, or even if they were for the good of man and not for the destruction of man. Are you following? I hope you are. So that idea of the exercise of power is clearly stated by man. One of the interesting things it says in Genesis chapter 2 was that God brought every living thing to Adam, and that Adam named all of them. Adam called all of them by name, and whatsoever he called them, that is the name that was given to them. So he had that reality in him because he had that part that God gave him to be the king and the ruler over all. Now, when man saw all the created the creation of God, the cattle and the beasts and the fowls, and all of them had partners and so on, a need arose, and that need was that there was nothing there for man, there was nothing there for Adam, and so God saw it necessary that he would make for him an help. And I realized many times we say an help meet, but the truth is the word meet is really actually means fitting, that God made for him an help meet for him, and help that was fitting for him, and help that was right, and help that was perfect for him. So what God did was, I was just looking at these things over and over again, you see different ideas coming out. God is the master surgeon, and I was looking at this and I realized God was the first person to actually create to perform a surgery on man. Was the first person to perform a surgery on man, and the pattern set by God is still used even today as we speak. And the pattern was simply this: he did the work of an anesthesiologist on Adam. What was that? He put Adam to sleep. He caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and while Adam was asleep, while he was out, God performed this creative act. And what was that? He made an incision. He took a rib from Adam, and he carefully sutured up that wound, I guess perfectly mended. And from the rib, the word says, he brought forth a woman. And oh, excited Adam was when he saw this woman, that he says, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And he called her woman. Well, he called her woman, right? So my question is this: was this woman a real help meet to Adam, or fitting for Adam, or was this woman the cause of his fall? I'm just throwing that question in there, and as I ask you to think about it, because it is clear to me that if and when a man put a woman in a higher place than a help, that the man or we men run the risk of the woman causing grave problems for us, and especially in the spiritual realm. Now, I don't mean that in a harsh way, and you ladies, please don't take this in a wrong way. But I mean, God made Eve to be a partner to Adam, and not to be a dictator. God made her to be by his side. God made her to be a member of a team, that they both will work and rule together. But here is something that I want you to say. I love my wife dearly, and I love my wife perfectly, and she knows that, right? But when it comes to certain things that deals with my spiritual connection, I listen only to one person. I listen only to the Spirit of God which is within me, and so my wife will never get me to compromise certain principles that are deeply embedded in me by the Lord himself. That will never ever happen, right? I mean, if she's in trouble, of course I'll help her out, but not by giving up my allegiance to God, right? In fact, I was thinking on something more recently, and well, as I was putting these thoughts together, I want you to consider what happened with Eve And in the scenario that God brought forth with the tree of knowledge and good and evil, since Ian mentioned that earlier. I believe they work together as a wonderful team. And I also believe that God came down and spoke to Adam and Eve about what happened in heaven, because something happened in heaven just about the time of the creation of the earth. And I suppose God gave him whatever caution there was to give, because that's what a loving father would do if an enemy is set loose around them. Okay, now it's not recorded about what God said. When you look at Genesis, it's not recorded about what God said to Adam and Eve. But I can take Eve's account to be accurate, since what Eve said to the serpent was, I believe, perfectly true. I don't think that there was any need to lie there, because Eve was perfect. There was no need to lie. In fact, I'm talking about this, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, and I'm just talking about this, but should I probably just go ahead and read for you just a couple of verses here in Genesis chapter 3, because that's the scenario I'm bringing out here in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. Oh, I'm not sharing it. Hold on. In Genesis chapter 3, consider what happens here. The serpent comes and is talking to Eve. It is talking to Eve, and look at what the serpent says to Eve. Yea, hath God said, I'm sorry, let's just highlight that. Yea, hath God said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden. Okay, so that was the question. And what did the woman say? And the woman answered and said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God had said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest ye die. Now, here's the perspective I want to bring. I believe that what Eve said was accurate. I did read some other commentaries on that verse, where it was said that Eve added something because God never said, but I cannot go with those narrations. It says, Eve says, you're not right. The serpent says, did God say don't eat of any of these trees? The Eve says, no, God never said that. God says we can eat of every tree except for this tree. Okay, God said of this tree we shall not eat of it, neither shall we touch it, lest we die. Now, I believe that Eve gave an accurate perspective on what God said, right? God says don't eat of it, and God says don't touch it. There is no other reason, because as I said, Eve was in perfection. She was in perfection when she was talking to the serpent. She did not eat the fruit or anything. They were just having a conversation, and she's telling the serpent the truth. This is what God says. What you said is not true. This is what God said. All right. So in the conversation with Eve, the serpent now begins to tell Eve certain things. First thing he said, God is not telling you the truth. He says, Eve says, if you touch this or eat, you shall surely die. And the serpent said to Eve, you shall not surely die. So the first, I want you to see the first thing he said, God is not telling you the truth. You shall not die. But what will happen is that your eyes will be opened, and what will also happen is that you'll be as gods, not knowing good and evil. You'll be as gods, knowing good and evil. And so what I want you to think about was that Satan deceived her. First, Eve had no knowledge what it means to die. No knowledge. She simply heard the word die. She heard the word death. She did not know what that means, okay? Because she was just created. She was a young created being, and all she understood was that life is what it is. We are enjoying life. We are living life. This is as far as she knows. Now, the other thing is that Satan promised was as a consequence of what would have happened if she took the action that he was taking. Now, and the other thing was that her eyes would be open. The other thing is that when her eyes open, she will know certain things, and when her eyes open, she will be able to discern between good and evil. But Satan did not tell her that that also was a part of her dying experience. Now, I want you to notice something in verse 6, and I have to just go back there quickly. In verse 6, oh, not that. something that the narration says that I want to bring to your attention and just ask you some questions quickly in verse 6. Verse 6 says, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also to her husband. But my question is, how did the woman saw that the tree was good for food? How did the woman saw that it was pleasant to the eyes? How was it pleasant to the eyes? And how was it that the tree was desired to make one wise? I mean, this is all an assumption, but I believe one, the serpent himself was eating of the fruit, and I believe two, the serpent was letting her know that it was the eating of the fruit that made him as wise as he was. So I believe it was something demonstrated to her, something that he was doing right before her that caused her to believe him. And when she believed, because based on his showing off of what this fruit did for him and the fact that he could eat the fruit, when she believed, she was fully deceived, fully convinced, and she brought this deception to Adam. Now, it seems interesting to me that Paul would say something like he did in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 14, where Paul says, for the man was not deceived, but the woman. I'm sure you've read that verse before. Not many people try to talk much about what Paul says there, but Paul says that the deception was really on Eve's part, and the deception was not so much so on Adam's part. Now, it seems that there's a trend, though, as I look through the Bible and I look at different examples. It seems like there's a trend when a man loves a woman, and she can turn his heart against God easily. It just seemed this way. And wow, if you think about this, there are examples that I could cite. I know that Ahab, the king of Israel, Ahab, his wife Jezebel turned his heart from God, turned him to become a Baal worshiper. And all the things that happened to Israel was simply based on the fact that Jezebel was the wife of Ahab. He was not even the king. He was just in the office of king, but Jezebel ran the kingdom, right? And under her, she had 400 prophets of the grove, 400 prophets of Baal, and 450 prophets of the grove. Now, think about even Samson and Delilah. Think how easily Samson told all of these secrets to Delilah, and he himself lost his own life, right? So I am saying, and not in a negative way because my wife is here, that you do have women doing things that look, New Testament tells you how that Herodias, remember Herodias, how Herodias, John the Baptist was in disagreement that she should be with this king, and she caused the head of John the Baptist to be taken off, remember? And also I'm thinking of Ananias and Sapphira, but I can think of different examples. But I also can think of a man like Job, a man like Job who was straightforward, a man like Job who was true in his heart, a man like Job, and when the love of his life came and says, look at you, why don't you curse God and die? That he could look at her and say, woman, you speak like a foolish woman. You speak like a foolish woman. And he can correct her and let her know, look, regardless of what you see, nothing can touch my allegiance to God. So I'm just saying that I've seen where women have caused the downfall of many strong men of God because they wear them down. Well, my wife knows one thing about me. She never wears me down in the spiritual aspect. In fact, she doesn't even try in that way. She can wear me down in other things. She can wear me down to make decisions in other things, but never as it relates to my convictions, as it relates to my allegiance to God. Never. But here's an interesting perspective. For whatever reason, I chose that passage to talk about it. First Timothy chapter 2. I'm going to ask you to look at this verse in First Timothy chapter 2. I just mentioned it, where Paul talks about this this issue of the woman not being the man not being deceived, but the woman. Look at what he says. He says, it begins here in 13. He says, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. Then look at what he says next. He says, and you know what he was dealing with? He was dealing with the issue of women being silent in the church, women not subjugating others and becoming too boisterous in the church. He said that they were to be silent. He said that they were to learn at home. The perspective I've gotten from that, in case most people are not aware of it, is that in the, and I think even back in the earlier days, this is how it used to even be in some of the Adventist colleges out here, that the men and the women would not sit together, but they would sit on either side of the church, the men on one side, the women on the other side. And so when they talk, they would talk across to their husbands, and so that would cause some disruption in the service. And I think that's what Paul was dealing with, one, and two, that they should not be allowed to do these things because it's not orderly. Anyway, but he was also showing that they should not allow a woman to teach or to usurp or to be placed over the man. But there are cases, right? Because some people will say that that is unfair of God for God to do something like this. There are cases where there are no men to lead out. That you have men who are not strong in their conviction to God. They're not really stalwart in the kingdom, and women are far more in control of things, in connection with God, that in those cases, I don't see a problem. So it's not like Paul was saying, he was actually dealing with some issues that were taking place in the church. But generally speaking, the woman is a weaker vessel. The woman is not able to handle or to deal with some things like the man. The makeup of the woman is different. And I think that's what he was dealing with. Anyway, I think I might get myself into some trouble if I keep going along that part. Let me just go back to what Paul is saying here. Paul says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in transgression. Look at what he says next. Not many people have heard that have actually used this verse or ever uses this verse, but she says, nevertheless, she shall be saved in childbearing. Interesting perspective. Paul says, nevertheless, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. Now, somebody seeing that verse might say, okay, so brother Howard, what about those women who never have any children? They won't be saved? That's not the point I think Paul is making. I think what Paul is saying is a woman who does not understand or knows responsibility as a mother, is very selfish and self-centered, and especially he mentions clearly that if they don't continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety, that will be a means that God uses to save them. That's the point he's making. Now that takes me to the next perspective, and that is what happens right after sin. Just chapter 3 of Genesis is really the focus this morning, because right after sin, what happens are the things that I want you to look at with me carefully, see what happens, and then those are the things that we're going to build on as we go through this series. Now, remember, we're looking at sin, its effects, consequences, reversals, and removal. All right? So what I want us to do now is to consider some of the effects of sin on the human race, some of the effects of sin on Adam and Eve, since they were the human race at that time. What were some of these effects? Now, I'm going to just be talking about this and maybe not necessarily read it, but remember, I told you I'm focused on chapter 3 right now, and verses 7 on. Now, please consider that what happens next is that Eve and Adam had an encounter with the devil. Something happened with the devil through the serpent. Something happened to them. What happened to them is that first it says that their eyes were open and they recognized that they were naked. Now, I want you to notice that this was their condition even before. They were naked and they were not ashamed. The word says that they were naked, a light covered them, they were not ashamed. But something happened after they ate the fruit, after they disobeyed God. Something happened to them. What happened to them was an effect, or it was a consequence of what happened. Nobody said this was, nobody actually dictated that this would happen. God did not say the moment you eat this, you're going to recognize that you're naked. But this happened. They were naked and they became afraid of God. How do we know that? Because when God came in the cool of the day, see, nothing changed on God's side. And that is something I want you to keep in mind. That is something I want you to keep in mind. Nothing changed on God's side. And let me just mute this person here. Nothing changed on God's side. God came as he always did. He came in the cool of the day to look for Adam and Eve. But this time he came, and what did they do? There's something strange happened. They ran away from God. That never happened since they were created to that moment. Nothing of the sort ever happened. But they ran away from God, and they hid themselves from God. And God called, and Adam answered, and he says, "Where are you?" And he said, "We were afraid because we were naked and we hid ourselves." Now, it did say that they sewed some fig leaves and covered themselves, but God said to them, who told you that you were naked? Did you do what I said you should not do? And I guess then came some of these consequences that I want you to think of, because after they became ashamed, they were in fear, they were ashamed, they hid themselves. Look at the next thing they started doing. They began blaming each other. Blaming each other. So I want you to consider that all of these things that we're looking at are the effects and consequences of sin. It's to be afraid of God, to have fear of God, and also to hide from God. And look at what else we're looking at. To blame each other for our circumstance, to blame each other. Like when something is done, we try to blame. We put the blame as to why it happened this way, right? And so all of that is as a result of sin. Now I want us to look at some other consequences that I want to say they are enforced consequences. Now you may say, no, these are penalties. Now my wife and I had some you're saying something, Brother Ian? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, half of my screen was covered and I was thinking my mic was muted. I'm looking at some things that I'm tempted to say these are enforced consequences, or these are spoken consequences, or but they seem also to be penalties. Okay, because now here they are: Adam, Eve, the serpent. Adam, Eve, and the serpent, they're all before God, and now God began to declare certain things. Now, what God says, was it a punishment, a penalty for what they did, or was God saying certain things that because of you did this, I will do this? So he spoke to the serpent. He said, look, because you have done this thing, on your belly shall you go all your life. You shall go on your belly all your life. And he says, dust shall be your food. You shall eat dust all your life. Now, was that a consequence, or was that a penalty? Was that something God put in place, or was that something that happened automatically after sin? It's sin. It seemed to me that the serpent went up to the point that God was speaking. The serpent was not on his belly. However, the serpent had moved before, whether the serpent had wings, whether the serpent had feet, I'm not sure what it had, but obviously that was not its mode of transporting itself. So once God told it that, once that curse came upon it, if we should use such a word, then the serpent began moving on his belly. The next thing I want you to recognize is what God said to the woman. Now, God also said to the serpent, that he was going to put enmity between the woman and the serpent, between his seed and her seed. There's something I believe that God put in place that was an started at that moment, an enmity between the principles of the serpent and the principles of the woman, the principles of the woman referring not just to Eve, but also to the church or the line of God afterwards. Next, God spoke to the woman, and God said, I will greatly multiply your sorrows. God says that in sorrow shall you bring forth children. And also it seemed very similar to what Paul was saying, that in childbearing she shall be saved. That the means by which God did this was a method by which this woman would be saved, a method by which this woman will come to understand and to know better her personal responsibility as an help for her husband, that she'll be able to work if she continues in faith and whatever that list of things was, and in sobriety to God, that she would be in charity, in holiness, faith, charity, holiness, with sobriety. So when I look at the different things God said here, it seemed to me, and above beyond that, God says that your desire shall be unto your husband. God also said that, and he shall rule over you. And the next thing, he turned to the man and he said, cursed be the ground for your sake. And then he talks about thorns and thistles and all of those things that would be brought forth from the soil, from the ground. And I'm still experiencing that even as I speak. Yesterday we were in the field and doing some stuff, and the same things are happening today. And he also said that by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. You shall survive in this way until you return to dust, because from dust you came, and unto dust you shall return. So these are the things that I'm seeing where that God said to them. Now I want to see those first as penalties for what happened, and you'll see as we unfold these things unfolds later on. But there were also other consequences, I believe, that were consequences now that were untold. In other words, God did not mention them. God did not mention them in the garden. God did not talk about these. But I want to mention these, and I'm going to ask you to think about them as well. And those are, one, aging. Aging. It was not mentioned that men would age because of sin, but aging was an untold consequence. I also believe that diseases was an untold circumstance. I also believe that sicknesses were untold circumstances that would have led to death, and more so, most times untimely death. So I believe these are consequences of sin that were not mentioned or talked about, but these are there. These are our underlying the curse are underlying the result of what sin brought into the world. Now, I want you to consider then, of all the things that we have looked at, that God's plan was not for any of the things that we're talking about here, for any of them to have happened. God's plan was thwarted. God's plan was stopped, and sin entered, and all of these things came into man's experience. Now, the plan of God is that he was going to remove sin. The plan of God is to come and remove that one thing that has stopped this plan, and that plan was to continue, and that is where it becomes beautiful. I just thought I'd take this time this morning to just talk about these, look at them a little bit, and help you to see and focus as to where we're going and whether or not these things were reversed and these things were removed. Look, the things that we discussed. The question is, did God return to man his dominion? I want you to consider these questions, and these are the questions we're going to open up later on as we continue the series. Did God return dominion to man? Did God remove these consequences, the effects of sin that were brought on the human race? Were these removed by God? Did God deal with those penalties, those curses that Jesus that he spoke to Adam and Eve? Were those curses removed? Now, notice I did not say will they be removed. Notice my question is specific. Were those removed? Did God do this, or did he not? And those are the things I'll be trying to explore and to look and to see if these things really happen. Now, I hope that it's what we shared it sets a good premise. What we shared sets a good premise for where we'll be going, and I'm looking forward to exploring with you in this area. You'll notice that as I wind down, my producer told me that we'll start a new year with new principles, and she gave me 45 minutes, and she says I'm doing well because I'm just about 40 minutes. So I'll probably leave it there for this morning and this afternoon, and I'll take some questions or comments, and then we can close off, if that's all right with you.
Brother Howard.
Brother Howard, this is Bobby Matthews talking.
Hold a little there, Sister Bobby. Brother Art is before you.
Oh.
Go ahead, brother.
Good morning, everyone. Just a thought question. In Genesis, we're told that we were made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we see God made man in his image, in his likeness. I'm just thinking, God brought forth a son without a woman. When God made man, he made man. And we also understand that Adam set about to name the creatures, all the creatures that God made. Thereafter, he recognized that everyone had a partner, but he never had any. And subsequently, God did something, put him back to sleep, and made a woman thereof. My thinking is it remotely possible that man prior to was able to bring forth an offspring without a woman? No one has to answer my question. It's just a thought question. But that's where my thought is.
Okay. Very, very interesting thought there, brother brother Alta. Yeah. But I'm not sure about that. Somebody asked that question before, and it was that what if, the question was really what if Adam lost his wife? What if he chose not to have listened to her? What would have happened to Adam? And I was saying, was God not able to make another wife for him? If he made a wife for him, could God not make another wife for him? Or maybe God would have worked out a way to save her in the same way he worked a way to save both of them. So maybe God would have worked out a way to save her. But I get that is speculation and assumption on my part, and maybe reasonable assumption and speculation as well. Go ahead, Sister Bobby.
Yes, I was wondering, how everything was perfect in the Garden of Eden. They didn't have any kind of, death or dying or waste. So I'm just wondering if Adam and Eve, if before they sinned, if they had, produced waste from their body, like sweat, uh, bowel movements, urine, and all these things was a byproduct of waste. Do you think that their bodies would function in a more efficient way and then have this problem?
It's interesting you asked that question, Sister Bobby. I think I've dealt with that some time ago in another sermon, where my thought was that there was no necessity for solid waste. So it's possible that there could be a gaseous you know exchange of instead of something solid. The ground didn't need fertilizing or any such thing, or manure of that kind. But it's just as your thought or and mine in looking at this thing. So I didn't see the necessity for something like that. But if something like that happened, I think that anatomy of our bodies were the same. So I would think that a gaseous what's the adjective, came out instead of something solid.
Yeah,
Oh
because
wait,
that would really mess up a beautiful garden. You got all that smell and stuff. It's really nasty.
Yeah, but there
And
be no
so
need, there be no smell, since the fact was that everything that they were eating were nourishing their bodies. So there be no need for no smell. It was all perfect.
Mhm.
I think the
And
smell, the smell and all of
also,
that came as a result of sin, where
oh,
decay and death. That's what brought the stench that we know of today. That's what caused it.
yeah.
brother,
So
brother
another,
Howard. Yeah. Oh wait,
Yeah,
Howard.
yeah.
another
Just a moment there. Let her finish, and then it's Peter, and then Brother Lloyd.
another question I had in mind was, I think Brother David was touching, or you was touching about marriage too. And about forgiveness this morning, but I was wondering about Job. Do you think that Job's wife Job forgave his wife unconditionally after all that she did, or did the Lord provide him with another wife because he had 7 more kids? However many more kids he had. He had the same amount of kids after, you know,
Yeah,
the
right.
Lord restored him. So I was wondering if he had the same wife that discouraged him and stuff, told him to curse God and die. So I was just wondering, I've always wondered that, what happened to his wife.
Well, I think I'm not sure if that was for Brother David or for me, but I think the wife saw her folly. I don't think that it was that the wife was against him. I think the wife was just that loving partner that saw what was happening, knowing he was a man of God, and I think she was probably leaning towards his friend's opinion that this was what God was doing to him. So I think the fact that Job straightened her out and said, "You speak like a foolish woman," she probably looked into herself and recognized that it was foolish for her to have said the things that she said. And I also believe that it was the same wife that produced the other children as well. One of the interesting things was I was mentioning to a friend how that I was probably talking about this on Wednesday night as well, how that Abraham, after his body died, he had no erections and Sarah's womb was dead and menstruation had stopped. That God's miracle brought back erections. He was so strong that Abraham, even after Sarah died, I believe Sarah didn't die, she would have had more kids. But after Sarah died, Abraham married again. Did you know that, Sister Bobby? And had 6 more sons. So that's an interesting perspective. So I do believe that God is able to do. I believe God is able to do it. I believe she was the mother of the other kids.
Some problem with that
Oh,
erection
Yeah. All
because
right.
he
But
never
it's
seemed to
not.
have any problem with Hagar.
Let's not get into the erections. I'm just using Paul's argument. Paul says that he didn't consider his body now dead. So, but maybe we talk about that later on a little bit, right?
It never did for Hagar though.
No, but I'm saying Agar was before. Remember, it was years later. It was years after Agar that he actually reached a place where his body was now dead. It's Paul's argument. He said his body was now dead and didn't consider it nor the deadness of Sarah's womb. So that's the point. Go ahead, Brother Peter.
yeah, I suppose one of the reasons why people say that Eve did something, because Genesis 2:17, God said nothing about touching. God just said, "You shall not eat of it." God didn't say touch, but Eve added touch. So that's why some people say that Eve added some things. Another point, when
Yeah, but
God said,
you see the point I was making, that
yeah,
there was no reason for her to say something that was not true, because it would have been accusing her of telling a lie even before she sinned. You understand?
right, I get the point. But I suppose the reason why people say that, because when you look at Genesis 2:17, it said nothing about touch.
Right.
Right. And the other point, where it says she shall be saved in childbearing, do you think it's just talking about Eve?
No, well,
And if it,
Paul commenting afterwards is talking about the women in
yeah,
in Timothy.
well, I believe it was specifically talking about Eve. And the reason why it said that, because out of her would come the Savior, which is Christ. If she did not have a child, she could not have been saved.
Okay. All right, that's a thought. But I believe he was talking generally of all women, that even though she was the person deceived, because the chapter and the focus, the the context of the chapter was the fact that women should be silent based on what was taking place in the church, and he was dealing with them and not necessarily speaking of the beginning. But no problem. Point taken. Go ahead, Brother Lloyd.
Oh yes, that passage of scripture in Genesis that God says, "Come, let us make man." Was God speaking to Jesus, or what Jesus have to do in the creation of man?
Okay. I'd made it clear earlier that that Jesus was the person that did all the creating, based on the verses we looked at in Colossians chapter 1 and in also in First Corinthians chapter 8. So
John 1.
so the issue really was that God was speaking to his son, because it was God. The verse says that God was the source of all things, but Jesus was the channel or the medium through which all creation took place. And as Paul says, whether there be thrones or dominions or principalities and powers, all things were made by him and for him. And without him was not anything made that was made. That's what it says in John chapter 1. Right. So I believe God was speaking to his son when he says, "Let us." The Trinitarians use that, Brother Lloyd, interestingly. The Trinitarians uses that same verse and says, "See, God said, let us." So it is talking about the three of them. But what I found in the English language is that us can mean 2, 10, a million, or 10 billion. Okay, us don't mean 3. And you know that they have tried actually to convince us that us means 3. See, God says let us, and so that us means 3. When Isaiah when God said to Isaiah, who will go for us? See, it's the 3. And they even say holy, holy, holy. Why 3? Because holy, holy, holy means the Trinity. You have heard all of those things, but I don't buy that any at all.
Right.
Yeah, indeed.
I have a
All right,
question.
go ahead, Sister Margaret.
Also,
I was thinking in chapter 2 when why would God tell them that if they eat of the tree of good and evil that they will surely die? The knowledge, knowing that God is about knowledge, knowing truth, and how would that play today with us? Knowledge is power, and Hosea speaks about that. That knowledge is important and that he doesn't want us to be ignorant. So I'm thinking, why would God say that to take not you die if you get the knowledge of good and evil?
Okay. I don't think God said that they would die if they got good and evil. I think what God was saying to them, the tree was simply just a test. It was just a door. I mean, God could have put a stone. He could have put a rose. He could have said, this flower, don't touch this flower. If you do this, it was simply just a test whether or not their allegiance would be to Him or to themselves. So I don't think it was that God was withholding knowledge from them. I think it was simply because the truth is they had all the knowledge they needed, excepting they did not know sin. They did not know evil. They knew only good. And so the devil was right that if they did this, they would know good and evil, because the moment that they did, they knew they were naked. They started knowing the other side of God, which is evil, to be in opposition to God. So
I
I
think
don't
you
think
meant
it.
the other side of good.
I had a 2-part question, if you don't mind.
Sure, no
Uh,
problem.
and 3, are we speaking about the devil as a symbolic, as a reptile, or are we speaking about the devil as an angel, like he is Satan, a man? And what is the description, physical description of the devil? Because today, first thing come to your mind when they say devil, you see a red suit and horns.
Okay, okay. When in the story, we're speaking of the devil possessing a creature of one of God's creation, the serpent, or the snake. So we're just seeing the first case of demon possession as we look at it in Genesis there, not necessarily seeing him in it as himself. I think I think what the word of God says about him in both Ezekiel and Isaiah is that he's very beautiful, to be looked upon. I suppose maybe sin has marred his looks, like it does the creation of God. I believe the same thing has happened with him as well. But I know that is probably just for children, for children's imagination, to for the red suit with the horns and 3-teeth fork and all of that, But that's
But
not that's not.
you mean for surprise how people, adults, the first thing they think about and describing him, they don't have they don't know who he is. They think about that. Now you're saying that the devil in this chapter 3 is literally a reptile, or is it an angel, a person, the devil?
No, no, I'm thinking the devil is like other angels are. They're ministering spirits. So the devil in his essence is a spirit. I believe what we're seeing in chapter 3 here is that the devil possessed this snake. So he had possessed this snake and talking through the snake, just like he possesses people today and speaks through them and acts through them, or causes them to do heinous acts,
Hmm.
Howard.
Right. Yeah, brother. Yeah.
Okay. A couple of things I wanted to comment on. Let us comment first on the one that Sister Margaret raised. about the good and evil. I think you cover most of it by saying that Eve had seen Adam and Eve had experience with good, but they didn't have the
Only.
knowledge of evil.
Hmm.
Right. They didn't have the knowledge of evil. So once they, because I mean, you said that God could have tested with anything else, but God called that tree the tree of good and evil for a specific reason. And there's a reason that if they transgressed by going to that tree, then they would have experienced the knowledge of evil. The next thing that I wanted to um, speak about is we oftentimes judge Adam to say, why did he bother to listen to his wife? Why didn't he just allow God to create a new wife for him? But you think about how he loved Eve because she was bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. And think about how he didn't want to let go of her. And put the same situation to God and ask yourself the question, why did God not just wipe out mankind and make another new race? He
Right.
made us in his image. There was a connection between he and us. He loved us in that special way. And he just didn't want us part with us and just start a new race all over again, start a new human, and create another lump of clay and breathe breath in him again and start over. I mean, he could have done that for Eve. I mean, for Adam, creating a new Eve. But I know God understood how Adam felt about Eve, just the same way he feels about us being made in his image. I wanted to just make that comment.
Very good point. Very good point.